So hi again, gentle folks. I am here with another video. And the reason why this video is being generated is because it's a follow-up to to an original video. Seems like I may have generated a lot of excitement with my past few videos where I was talking about the Hebrew Israelites and speaking of hard questions for the Hebrew Israelites. Now, needless to say, I got the expected responses, which I did address in the previous video, but I got the expected responses of basically the dismissive tone. You don't know what you're talking about. One person told me I need to repent. Nobody has been rude or nasty, so thank you. And I could understand. I am discussing a topic that is near and dear to some people's hearts, and usually when that's the case, people can get pretty defensive about stuff like that. Again, remember, I was once a Christian years ago, and I was in a similar situation. People came to me questioning my faith, or questioning things about my faith, or questioning things within my faith. I got a little defensive, and one way that you took care of that is by dismissing people. You don't know what you're talking about. You need to be enlightened. You need a Spirit of God to illuminate the Word to you. And since you're not a Christian, well, you're not going to get it. You're not going to understand it. So the dismissive tone, you don't know what you're talking about. Why do I need to pay attention to you? You don't even believe. I shouldn't even be taking my time to even talk to you about anything. So, basically it comes down to bye. So I was expecting that. So I'm not surprised. I'm not shocked. Again, no one has been rude. No one has been nasty. Might have been some sharp responses, but nobody has been rude or nasty. After all, it is social media. It is YouTube, and people can say whatever they want to say and react however they want to react. I have no control over that. But for those of you who've been respectful, thank you very much. Anyway, I don't know if I can respond to point by point. I've tried to do so in the comment section, right? As most of you have noticed, I've been responding to everyone. A lot of YouTubers don't do that, but I try my best to go in and respond to each of you. Well, one of the big overarching thing that's been going on here is the Bible. Now, what I've been told by some people here is that the Bible is a history book of the Hebrews. And like I've mentioned to a few others there, I do not deny that at all. Not at all. It is a history book of sorts of the Israelite people. The history that is told there, it's not told with your traditional history in terms of you reading something and everything that you read in there you can somewhat touch, if I can use that word. In the Bible, there are mentions of places like Jerusalem, Egypt. We know those places exist. Mentioned Babylon. If you went back and looked through ancient history, you realize there were such places. It mentions Ethiopia. It mentions a few other places that may have carried other names in ancient times, like, for example, Persia, which today it's Iran. It mentioned Mesopotamia, which is today Iraq, and I guess you can say parts of Kuwait. So it mentions these places. So you look at that and you say, well, the Bible does contain some factual things. It does mention some factual, actual places. My argument had been, in some of the previous videos, is that while those things are going on, the writers living in their time, a time of superstition, a type of not understanding a lot of things about science and the natural world, applied the spiritual to things they did not understand. So, for example, if two countries go out and start a war right now, like, say, for example, Ukraine and Russia, whatever they're doing, you're not going to really read anyone saying, and God came down and the Lord smote the soldiers of Ukraine, or the Lord sent, I don't know, his chariots down to fight on behalf of the Russians. Sorry about that. Give me 1 second. Just had to get light back in here. Yes, you're not going to find stories of stuff like that. It would be sort of wild to throw that in. No one will really take you serious if you start talking about tanks filing out of Moscow and going down into Ukraine and traveling to particular sections and doing whatever. You put the story over like that. People will say, yes, I do know what a tank is. And people will say, okay, I do understand the route that they're taking. I can look at a satellite. I can look at different things. I can verify these places they're going through. But if a writer who is writing the story about this war decide to throw in, and I saw the Lord leading the soldiers, and then the angel of the Lord came out and did such and such, people will be looking at you like, yeah, okay. Believe it or not, that's exactly how the Bible was written. Or that's how the stories are written in the Bible. Mixed in with the actual history of things that may have gone on is the divine element that's added in. That's the part where I'm like, I shouldn't say I have an issue with it. I'm not angry at that. It makes it for fascinating reading. Yes, spices up the story a bit. But if I am looking at Sennacherib's invasion, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, if I'm looking at his invasion when he came down to Israel, came down to, what was the capital of Israel back then? I forgot. Was it Samaria? I don't remember at this point. But he came down and he invaded Israel. I can follow that. He invaded Israel, the kingdom of Israel. He took away captives, or he exiled a population, or whatever. I can understand that. He besieged the city and he killed many captives or whatever. I could understand that. But when you start reading stories about, and there were two beggars who came up to the city walls and they realized that if they stayed in the camp, they will die. If they go to the camp, well, they may also die, but take a chance because somebody may feed you if you go up to the camp. Then you have to hear, or you read the story where the Lord made their feet to sound like the stomping of chariots of the enemy coming toward them, and it caused the Assyrian camp to panic and leave and run away. When you read about the part about the beggars walking in and the Lord made their footsteps sound like that of mighty chariots coming through, you start thinking that someone is getting a little curious, a little carried away with the details of the story. But anyway, so I don't get too sidetracked or whatever, I wanted to go ahead today and talk about something that is very, very important. And not only is it important, trust me when I tell you, I cannot explain all of this in a 30-minute video, in a 1-hour video, or whatever. This is not an academic video either, so I am not here to sit down with scholars and archaeologists and we discuss this matter, and you could say, well, hey, there are people in here with degrees behind their name, PhDs, masters, whatever they may have out there. They're doctors, or this is what their profession is. I am not an archaeologist. I am not a certified historian. I am not some certified scholar, okay? So I know I can be dismissed on just that alone, but just hear me out, okay? Just hear me out. So we want to talk today about, because a lot of the people who came in to listen to the video, they mentioned the Bible, they mentioned God, and they mentioned Hebrews. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do here is I wanted to explain or look into this Hebrew God, known as, to some people, it's known as Yahweh. Some people just call him God, depending on your faith. Some people say it's Jesus. Some people call him Jehovah, whatever. But let's just say we're talking about the biblical God that everyone has seemed to be referencing, despite of whatever names they may use. There is one particular chapter and verses in the Bible that is sitting right here in plain sight. I'm sure a lot of people have read it. I have read it, my 4 times reading through the Bible. I have read it, just passed by, didn't think much of it. Because remember, back then I was reading the Bible devotionally. So I already had a belief system in mind going into reading the Bible. So as I was going into reading the Bible, I already had biases in place, all sorts of different things in place while I was reading the Bible. Okay? So I was not reading it with an academic or critical mind to notice certain things in it that would have probably jumped out at me. Okay? Well, here is one of them sitting right here in plain sight, and a lot of people have probably read over it and have not paid much attention to it. That is Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 7 down to verse 9. Now, the chapter, given a little bit of context, the chapter is a song of Moses. In other words, this is Moses' swan song. He's old, he's up in age, he's about to die. And when I say Moses, remember, Moses didn't write this, okay? If Moses existed. Writers, scribes, wrote this much later on. Now, some of this may have been oral history that was passed down, and some of it may have just been creative imaginations from the actual writers. So Moses didn't write this, but it's attributed to Moses as a song or a swan song. He's about to leave, and he's now addressing the people of Israel. They have traveled through the wilderness for 40 years. They are now on the cusp of entering the land of Canaan. And he starts off by saying in verse 1, "Give ear, O ye heavens, and I will speak, and hear, O earth, the words of my mouth." But I want to jump down to chapter 7. Now what he's doing, remember, he's speaking to a younger generation of Israelites here. Hebrews, if you want to call them that. The older generation, the older unbelieving generation had pretty much died out, or they're now aged. Now he's talking to the new generation that is about to go in to conquer the land of Canaan. He says to them, "Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations." He tells them, "Ask your father, and he will show you. Thy elders, and they will tell thee." Again, this is Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 7 through 9. So he's now telling them, young people, ask your elders. Ask your elders about this. Remember, let them tell you about the days of old, way back when. And he goes on in verse 8, and it says, "When the Most High divided the nations, their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of people according to the number of the children of Israel." This is from the King James Version. Again, read that verse or listen carefully. Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. "When the Most High divided the nations, their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel." Now, in reading that that verse, or those verses I just read, it doesn't seem like there's anything there. Basically says when God divided the earth, he separated, the sons of Adam, separated the earth amongst the different peoples, and he set the bounds according to the number of the children of Israel. Again, doesn't seem like there's anything there. But take a closer look. Few things to consider here. Number one, it says when the Most High divided the nations, their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam. Now, if you go back into Genesis chapter 10 or 12, somewhere between 10 or 12, and I guess I could look it up right now, right? But I don't feel like going over there right now, so just trust me on that. But somewhere between Genesis chapter 10 and 11, chapter 10 and 12, there's something called the Table of Nations. That chapter, at least the early part of the chapter, describes after the flood how God divided the nations according to the various people. So there's a patriarch, and then it's listed, basically Noah had 3 sons. So after the flood, it tells you how the nations came about through these 3 sons of Noah. And it lists a set of nations. So Ham has these nations, Japheth has these nations, Shem has these nations, or these nations derived from these 3 sons of Noah. Well, when you're reading it, if you look at verse 8 here, it says that these nations were divided according to the number of the children of Israel. There's one problem. When the nations were divided, there was no nation known as Israel. Shem, who was an ancestor of Abraham, and Abraham being the father of the Israelite nation, Abraham was not even alive. So if the nations are being divided according to Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and they're being divided at that point in time, how can they be divided according to the number of the children of Israel when Israel was not even a nation when this dividing was taking place? In fact, Israel is not even mentioned in the table of nations. Israel became a nation much later on. So right there's a problem. How can these nations back then be divided by a nation that did not even exist as yet? As a matter of fact, again, when the nations are listed, Israel is not one of the nations that is listed in that list. Ironically, the table of nations lists 70 nations, and keep track of that number 70. All right. So, if they were not divided by the children of Israel, or could not be divided by the number of the children of Israel because Israel did not even exist at the time, what's going on here? That's one thing. Keep that in mind. The other thing was, it says, when the Most High divided the nations, their inheritance, when he divided the nations, it goes on to say, when he separated the sons of Adam, meaning the table of nations, according to these three sons of Noah, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. Now we go on to verse 9, and it says, for the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. So, you have an entity here known as the Most High who's doing the dividing. But then it goes on in verse 9 and it says, but the Lord's portion, the Lord's inheritance is his people. Jacob is the portion that is allotted to him. Or Israel is the portion that is allotted to him. Another name for Jacob being another name for Israel. When you look at it, look closely, you're realizing that it's talking about two different personalities here, two different entities. There is the Most High, and then there is the Lord. Those verses are not going to make any sense if you happen to say that the Most High and the Lord are the same persons, because it makes no sense to say the Lord is inheriting the people of Israel to himself. You do not inherit something from yourself. You inherit it from someone else. So right off the bat, you realize, wait a minute, is the Most High and the Lord two different persons, two different entities? It would make the most sense. The Most High is doing the dividing, and as he's doing the dividing, Israel, Jacob, is the inheritance that he gives to the Lord, a different entity. Now, the way this is going to make sense, or make more sense to you, is for us to go back and visit that part that says the number of the children of Israel. We've already established that when the nations were divided, how could they be divided by the children of Israel when the children of, not even the children of Israel, the nation of Israel didn't even exist? Abraham wasn't even around. He was years down the road to come along. Much less Jacob, Isaac, the patriarchs of the Hebrew nation. So, the number of the children of Israel. Something seems wrong. Something seems amiss. We can fix that right now. Now, what I just read to you was from the King James Version. And I know the Hebrew Israelites, if I'm not mistaken, depending on which group you're talking to, I know they clutch the King James Version Bible. I've heard some of them saying King James was a black man, and that's a whole other story, right? But understand there are different translations of the Bible. The King James Version Bible was translated from the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text was a Bible that did not come about until about 900 years after the time of Jesus, figuring he existed. That's when that book came around. And that was a translation of the Hebrew text. So it only came around about 900 years after the time of Jesus. That is the Bible, or the translation, that the King James Version built its version off of. But there are other texts that were around before that. And one of them that we know now, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And these, according to scholars, were written prior to the time of Jesus. So in other words, it's much older than the Masoretic texts. And there are some modern translations today that skip over the Masoretic texts because it's kind of a younger version and go further back to the DSS, or the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it builds off of that to build their interpretation. Well, one of those that does that, I think it's the Revised Standard Version. Now, if I go ahead to Deuteronomy chapter 32, and I go, and you know something, I'm probably gonna have to do this video in parts. So you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 22, and you go down and you go to the Revised Standard Version of the Bible. So if I go to the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, again, if I'm not mistaken, the Revised Standard Version doesn't feed off of the Masoretic text. It goes back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, okay? And I'm going to read those same verses that I just read. And you're going to notice a little bit of a change. But that little subtle change changes the whole dynamic of these verses. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 7 through 9, according to the Revised Standard Version. It reads like this: Remember the days of old. Consider the years long past. Ask your father, and he will inform you. When the Most High appointed or apportioned, separated, the nations, when he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the gods. Then it goes on. The Lord's own portion was his people, Jacob his allotted share. If you look at this very carefully, it says according to the number of the gods, not according to the number of the children of Israel. Now it makes more sense. Well, it may not make sense to you right now until I explain it. In that part of the ancient world, there was a belief that there was something known as the Pantheon of gods, or a divine council of gods. And this was all over the ancient world, whether it's Greece, Egypt, Canaan, Babylon, Acadia. There was a belief in the region around the Mediterranean, around the Western Middle East, Northern Africa, that there was like a father god and a mother goddess, and they produced children that they were called gods. These gods, the father, mother, and the children, made up a council, a pantheon of gods. Depending on where you were in that region, there was a belief that there were a total of 70 gods. Remember I told you to remember that number? 70 gods, 70 nations. And according to this passage, it is saying that these nations were apportioned or given out to the individual gods. You get this nation, you get that nation, you get this nation. But because we're talking about the Hebrews here, because we're talking about the Israelites, it drifts off to which one of these gods inherited the nation of Israel or the people of Israel. It mentions the Lord. The Lord is not the same as the Most High. As a matter of fact, if you look at certain Bibles, the Lord is translated as Jehovah, which is of course a much later English translation, mind you. But the Lord is distinct from the Most High, which is consistent with the belief in those days that the Most High was the Father God, and the Lord to the Israelites is their God, the God that was over their nation. And now it makes more sense when you read in the Bible where it talks about the gods of the other nations. But it just happens to be that Israel was given over to their God, which we know as Yahweh. So when you're reading in the earlier parts of the Bible, or going further back in ancient history, before it was finalized, before it was fine-tuned later on, there was a belief that there were more than one God out there. There were gods, and these gods were given responsibility of the individual nations. 70 nations, each god got a nation. Now, Israel was not around at the time. And it makes sense, because you notice what happens is that at the burning bush, Moses encounters a bush that was burning and a voice in that bush. Prior to that, it was like you read about God in the Bible, dealt with individuals like Abraham and whatever. But now this voice shows up to Moses and says, almost you could hear the voice saying, "Hey Moses, I'm here to handle my responsibility right now. And I understand that my people that I inherited, I understand they're down in Egypt and they're in bondage. Now I need to step up to the plate and take care of my people." Think of a father who decides to show up years later and decide, "Hey, I need to take responsibility of my children." Moses says, "Hey, who are you? I don't know who you are." "Don't worry about that. I am what I am. I am that I am. Just go down to Egypt and tell that guy to let my people go." Moses goes, does whatever he has to do. This God, this Lord, who is now making himself known to the people of Israel, delivers them, brings them into the wilderness, to Mount Sinai, and he says, "Hey, I am your God. I'm here, showing up to take care of you guys, to do what I'm supposed to do. You guys are my responsibility. And what I want you to do now is we want to have a covenant here." And one of the first things he says, well, according to what the Bible tells us, one of the first things, or the first commandment, was, don't have any other gods before me. Didn't mean that other gods didn't exist, mind you. What he's basically saying is, listen, you are sworn to me, and I am sworn to you. Keep your eyes off of the other gods. They exist. They're not my responsibility. They're not your responsibility. And you're not their responsibility. Your covenant is between you and I, like a husband and a wife. No disloyalty here. We read in the Bible that the Israelites said, "Yeah, we'll go ahead with this covenant and everything like that. You did all this for us. We'll go ahead and follow this covenant." And then as the Bible goes on and we read the narrative, basically they just never kept up on their end of the bargain. And we all know what happened at the tail end of that he sent them into exile. And of course, Israel was banished and lost in history to some extent. Now you may say, you are talking pure nonsense. Let's take a look at something. Let's check the tapes. Now, skipping over a whole lot here, right? Because I'm trying to do this in parts and I don't want to go ahead and, keep you guys going. But if we go to the book of Judges, let's go to chapter 11, book of Judges, right? So now, the Israelites back then, what did they believe? How did they look at the world around us? Don't have us now forcing what we want them to think, or what we would prefer they would have believed. Let's let them speak for themselves. So now, Jephthah, he is a judge in Israel, more or less like a tribal leader, more or less like a leader before Israel had their kings, before the monarchy. So he's like the leader, the de facto leader of the people of Israel. Now something pops up, something pops off, and there is a dispute over land. At this time now, the people of Israel had conquered Canaan, driven out the Canaanites, massacred them, according to the Bible. Yes, massacred them. And now they're settled in the land. But along the borders, there's still some dispute of whose land is this and whose land is that, and who gets this portion and whatever. So to avoid a conflict, Jephthah sends a delegation down to Ammon or Moab. I think it's Ammon he sent them to. He says, hey, listen, go down there. Let's settle this dispute about land. So when the messengers from Israel shows up to the king, let's go to verse 19 of chapter 11. It says, Israel then sent messengers to King Sihon of the Amorites. I said Ammonites, Amorites. King of Heshbon. And Israel, or the delegation, said to him, let us pass through your land to our country. But Sihon did not trust Israel to pass through his territory. So Sihon gathered all his people together and encamped at Jahaz and fought with Israel. So it goes on and it mentions that. But then it goes on and it says, then the Lord, the God of Israel, gave Sihon, this is verse 21, verse 21. Then the Lord, the God of Israel, gave Sihon and all his people into the hand of Israel, and they defeated them. So Israel occupied all the land of the Amorites who inhabited the country. Then it goes on and it says, they occupied all the territory of the Amorites from the Arnon to the Jabbok, and from the wilderness to Jordan. So now the Lord, the God of Israel, has conquered the Amorites for the benefit of his people Israel. So again, the Israelites are basically giving a history to the king and saying, hey, we defeated your people, man, so that's why we have the land. So now the delegation who were there speaking before the king, in verse 23 they say, so now the Lord, the God of Israel, has conquered the Amorites for the benefits of his people Israel. Do you intend to take their place? Should you, he's talking to the Amorite king, and he's saying, should you not possess what your God Chemosh or Chemosh gives you to possess? Notice, Chemosh is a god over the Amorites. And the Israelites are basically saying, listen, we understand that's your land, and that's what your God, who's responsible for you, has given to you. And they go on and they say, and should we not be the ones to possess everything that the Lord, our God, conquered for our benefit? You notice the dynamic here? The Israelites are saying, we have a God. He helped us to conquer lands. The lands we conquered belongs to us because that's the land that our God has given to us. We respect the fact that you have your God and he gave you your land to possess. Let's not have a dispute here then. Your God, your land, your people. His people. Our land, our God, we are his people. There is no argument here that Yahweh or the God of Israel is saying, well, that land over there belongs to me. Don't you know I'm the great God of the universe? Don't you realize I'm the great God of the universe and all this land belongs to me and I can give it to whoever I want to give it to? That's not what's going on here. Again, this is the early version of how the Israelites viewed the world around them and viewed their own religious beliefs. But what we then later find out is that eventually this belief begins to become fine-tuned. And the Israelites, after a while, in their writing, now again, we're not even talking about reality here. This is just theological writing where anyone can think up of anything when it comes to the heavens and what's happening in the spiritual world. You could just really make up anything that's going on out there. All right? But this was the early belief that there was a father God, a mother God, 70 children. Each God was given a nation. The nation of Israel was given to Yahweh, or the Lord. Yahweh does his thing, comes down, delivers his people. meets Moses at the burning bush, declares who he is, or lets Moses know, listen, I'm the guy that's here to take care of my people. Moses follows his commandments, go down and into Egypt, does his thing. The Lord is, of course, working behind the scenes. The spiritual world comes into this now. The people are delivered. They come to the desert. They make a covenant with Yahweh. That first generation of Israelites, through unbelief and whatever else, didn't see the promised land that they were supposed to go into. Joshua leads the people, the new generation, into the promised land. They occupy the land. They divide the land up according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And then while they're there, they start to be ruled by judges, eventually kings. The monarchy comes into place. The people waver, waffle, back and forth. One minute they're serving God, next minute they're not. One minute they're showing their allegiance to the national God, Yahweh. Then they fall back and forth, back and forth, back and forth through the books of Kings and Chronicles. And eventually their God had enough of it, and eventually allows them to go into exile, allows the Assyrians to pretty much destroy the northern kingdom of Israel. But then something dynamic takes place with the kingdom of Judah. Unlike the kingdom of Israel, they're led off into exile. While they're in exile, they're sitting, according to the Bible, by the rivers of Babylon. And they're sitting there perplexed. What's going on? Wonder what's happening here. Because remember, in those ancient times, people believed that their respective gods went out to fight ahead of them, led them into battle, led their kings into battle. So if your army got defeated, it said a lot about your God. Your God is not strong enough. Your God is weak. Our God went out, led us into battle. And there's a spiritual war going on that's being played out in the physical world. So if we defeated you, that means our God defeated your God. Which is one of the reasons why in ancient times, when the victor would come in and they will defeat another nation, they will destroy the images of the other gods, cut off their noses, deface them, do something, whatever, to show our gods defeated your gods. So now the Jews are in Babylon, sitting around by the rivers of Babylon. What's going on here? Got some problems. And they're looking at it like, wait a minute. Our God was supposed to be like, big dude around the way. What's going on? Why are we here in captivity? That proves the Babylonian gods are stronger. But something changes. And this is some ingenuity. It seems as though there were people that came forward. Because remember, in Israel, in the land of Israel, there wasn't this thing where everybody was believing in the same God, mind you. The big problem that they had in Israel, there was never really any unity. You had people out in the rural areas serving the gods along the border. So if they were near the Amorites, they might have been serving Chemosh. If they were near the Moabites, they may have been serving Molech. If they were near the Egyptians, they might have been serving some other gods over there. And there was always this cry from the Yahweh group, the Yahweh cult, that was more the national God. This is who the God Moses brought before the people and say, this is who you have your covenant with. And there was always a struggle to get the people to just line up with him. Because think about it from an economic standpoint. If you have one God, one temple that everybody goes to, that means all the money goes into one central place. That means if anything happens, there's one God that you rally around. But if you got a bunch of temples and a bunch of different gods and everything like that, that's taking money out of the coffer from the main temple that you're trying to keep intact and have the people rally around. Well, that was not the case in Israel. People were just doing their own thing. And so there was always this struggle of trying to bring the people to serve Yahweh. This is why when you go back to the book of Joshua, Joshua still was struggling with them back then. He says, look, you know what? Put away the gods of your fathers from across the river. In other words, from back in the land of Mesopotamia, from across the Euphrates River where Abraham came from. Put away those gods. And he says basically, you know what? He gave them an encouragement, put it away. Said, if that's what you want to do, that's what you want to do. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That means he was a Yahwehist. Just like David, he was a Yahwehist. They were true to that particular cult. So when they get into Babylon and are in exile, it looks like the religious leaders came forward and says, you know why we're here in captivity? You know why we're here? We did not follow Yahweh the way we were supposed to. That's why you're here. And the people are probably looking around like, we didn't? No, you guys weren't following his precepts. You weren't following his commands. You were chasing a bunch of other gods. You were worshiping a bunch of other gods. That's the reason why you're here. That's not anything strange, because people still do it to this very day. And I mentioned it in the first video I did in this series. Earthquake happens, you hear Christians jump up. It's because of wickedness. Oh, the people are wicked, and that's why God sent an earthquake. Some storm happens and whatever. Oh, as a matter of fact, I remember the great tsunami in Indonesia in, was it 2010? I remember reading where someone says, the reason why that tsunami happened over there because those people are Muslims and they don't believe in God. That's why. No different than what was happening back then. The people are like, we're here, and the religious leaders popped up. You're here because you did not follow the commandments of God. You guys were being wicked. You weren't doing what you were supposed to do. And now, the retelling of the story. And this is why when you go through the Bible, you find some confusions with certain things in there. That seems like it's contradictory, because the story is being told much later on. Now, it doesn't mean that some oral history did not pass down. But now it's like these writers sit down and say, okay, we have a narrative. We want to show you where you went wrong and what you didn't do, to explain why you ended up in the position you ended up in. They go back. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, blah, 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 blah. Did this, there was a great flood, all of that stuff. And remember, all that stuff is from older history coming from other people. It did not start with the Israelites. The Sumerians, around long before there was a nation of Israel, were giving stories of creation and stories of a great flood and so on. These were stories that the Jews basically brought over into their culture and more or less sanitized it for their consumption. Then they go on and basically they get to the point to show, here is how Yahweh became our God. Let's tell a story about Moses. Let's just tell a story about our people in captivity in Egypt. They come out, they make a covenant. See, basically, you guys made a covenant, and you didn't live up to that covenant. Now, of course, the reality of the fact is the reason why these people went into exile had nothing to do with any of that. It had to do with the fact that there was a king known as Nebuchadnezzar going around the area conquering. He was leaving Judah alone, more or less. But he passed through, and what they used to do back in those days was, listen, I'm not going to do you anything, but I just like you to just make sure you send some tribute our way, more or less like taxes. I'm not going to conquer you. I'm not going to do anything. Or yes, you are part of my kingdom, but I'll leave you alone. Just go ahead and pay your dues to the kingdom. The Jews decided they're not doing that. I think their king at the time wasn't Jehoshaphat. I forgot the name of the king at the time. He decided to make the grave mistake of telling Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, stick it up your, whatever. And he decided to align with Egypt, figuring by aligning with Egypt, he was going to have some backing power. Little did he know, Nebuchadnezzar was the head honcho. Nebuchadnezzar comes down, he conquers Egypt, and more or less on his way back, it was like, oh yeah, you want to align with these guys? Tell you what, tear down that temple, destroy this whole place, and take the best of them out of here and exile them to Babylon. That's the real story. But the backstory on the spiritual end, the way the writers put it, hey, the reason why you ended up in exile is because you did not live the right life. You did not do what you were supposed to do. And that's why you ended up in captivity. And this, as a lot of scholars will tell you, Scholars who are not coming in talking about, looking at the Bible from a devotional standpoint. But religious scholars would look and say this is when Israel went from their old polytheistic ways, which was, believing in different gods, or their henotheistic ways, which was to believe that other gods exist, but our God is the only one we're supposed to worship. We're aligned to only just this God. We believe other gods exist, but we're sworn off from those other gods, and we're only going to worship this God. So Israel went from an evolution from being polytheistic to believing there were other gods and worshiping other gods to henotheistic. I think as some people, that's a word that some scholar came up with. Henotheistic meaning more or less, we're only going to serve this God even though we believe other gods exist. They went from that. And at this point now, Israel goes to, or the Jews go to, something different. Monotheism. So they're sitting back and saying, wait, we're not in exile because our God is weak. We're not in exile because our God is not capable. We're in exile because our God allowed this to happen to us. The natural progression of thought then goes up. So our God was in control of all of this? Yeah. And if you read in the book of Isaiah, or the second part of the book of Isaiah, which a lot of scholars will tell you was written, there are two Isaiahs writing. One of them, apparently an Isaiah living in the kingdom of Judah when it was existing, and another Isaiah writing in the name of the prophet of Isaiah, writing after or during the Babylonian exile. And he goes, and the writing is like, wait a minute, our God is the only God there is. He's the only Savior. The gods of Babylon are nothing but wood and stone. So he wasn't defeated. He just allowed it to happen. But our God is the only God there is. The only true God. And all the other gods do not exist. That changes a lot from how it was written in the earlier parts of the Bible, where we believe other gods exist, just don't serve them. Even Solomon, when he dedicated the temple, in his wording, which other of the gods in the heaven are like you, Yahweh? Miriam, the sister of Moses, when she was singing her song of deliverance, basically says, who is like you? Basically talking about their God. Who's like you in the heavens? You're better than all the other gods. So when you start to see the story now, and these scribes are sitting down and writing the story, they're basically giving a story to explain the why we're in exile. So it wasn't like some scribe was running around behind Moses like, today Moses did this, or running about behind Abraham, well, Abraham did this today. No, these were things that were written and stated later on in time. Before I go, because I got to get back out of here, remember we were talking about Deuteronomy chapter 28? And we're talking about gods right now? I'm sorry, Deuteronomy chapter 32. If you go to Deuteronomy chapter 4, and this is going to make it a little bit more confusing, but I'll just tease you with this. There was a point in time in Jewish theology where they had to show, because remember, the belief around that region of the world at that time, was there was a supreme deity. But Yahweh was just another God amongst the other gods. Okay, if we're going to make a proclamation that he is the God of the universe, he created all things, and he's the supreme and only being, how are we going to get him to go from here up to the throne? How are we going to get him to up here? In Jewish theology, there became a morphing eventually, where all of a sudden, Yahweh is then blended in with El, or the Most High. He gets faded out. That old Father God gets faded out. And Yahweh takes control. And he's now the only one that's there. If you go to Deuteronomy chapter 4, and you go down to verse 19, and 20. Verse 19 says, "And when you look up to the heavens and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the host of heaven." Usually that phrase, the host of heaven, generally refers to those gods. He says, "Do not be led astray and bow down to them and serve them, things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples everywhere under the heaven. But the Lord has taken you and brought you out of the iron smelter, out of Egypt, to become a people of his very own possession, as you are now." So see how it's written there? You could tell more or less because Deuteronomy chapter 32 gives you two different entities. One has something and he gives it to another as an inheritance. But here it makes it sound that's faded out. It's phased out. It's as if the Lord, the God of Israel, is the one that's doing the separating. Is the one who separated and did this and gave out the inheritance. But there's more to this, because there's the divine council. And when you read about the divine council, you see where the ascendancy of Yahweh, he ascends above all the other gods. And he basically takes control of the council. It was almost like a coup, a bloodless coup, where El has a court, or the El has a court, or the Most High has a court. And it's as if Yahweh slides into the position of power and he dominates the other gods. And in doing so, Yahweh ascends. The other gods are basically subdued, put down, eliminated in Jewish theology. And the Jews then become monotheistic. So when they look back into their history, when they talk back into their history, the monotheistic writers who are writing in a way to point out that the people were polytheistic, but there was always a monotheistic belief in one God. I'll end there. Let that digest. Okay? Let all that digest. There's more. And there's more right there in plain sight. I just touched on this. You can go ahead and look up whatever I spoke about. You want to look it up on your own and see if I'm talking pure nonsense, or see if there are not people out there, scholars out there, who don't look into this the way that I explained it to you. You guys take care. Until the next video, I've got to get back downstairs. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being respectful. Like, share, discuss. Okay? You guys take care.